Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a place where even the walls seem to breathe sweetness. The marble floors are cool underfoot. The air is thick with frankincense and rosewater, and the palace guards are dabbing their wrists with myrrh before a long shift. Welcome to ancient Persia, where politics and perfume were part of the same conversation. You want to take a deep breath, unless you have allergies, because here, in the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, scent wasn't just for the nose. It was for the soul, the gods, the enemies, and the family down the road who needed to know you were royalty just by the wind. You probably wouldn't last a day, by the way. The combination of heat, formality, and mandatory jasmine oil behind the ears might overwhelm even your best spot energy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when we're relaxing together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the entrance of a royal estate in Persepolis, not the chaotic kind of palace. No sword fights in the hallway or poisoned goblets, at least not tonight. This place runs like a smooth, perfumed engine. Scribes rustle papyrus in rhythm. A eunuch, barefoot and unhurried, fans the air near a carved cedar door with a feathered whisk that smells faintly of sandalwood. And somewhere behind that door, a minor governor is panicking over whether his offering of saffron-scented oil is expensive enough to impress the king. Because in this empire, politics doesn't begin with war or taxes. It begins with how you smell. Perfume, or at least the idea of good smell, had deep roots in ancient Persia. Historians still argue whether the Achaemenids invented their own perfume recipes or adapted them from neighboring cultures like Mesopotamia and Egypt. Either way, by the 6th century BCE, Persian elites weren't just wearing fragrance. They were sending messages with it. Complex ones. There's a theory, slightly fringe but oddly believable, that some members of the royal court trained their noses the way musicians train their ears. They could detect not only what a person wore, but why, whether it was love oil, morning incense, or I'm about to ask for land myrrh. A sentence strategy, if you will. Imagine you're at a feast. The air is laced with cardamom, lavender, and something resinous you can't quite name. The Queen Mother walks past, trailing an unmistakable whiff of burnt agarwood. It means someone's death has been quietly acknowledged. Or perhaps, whisper more ominously, it means a death will be acknowledged soon. In Persian society, olfaction, that's your sense of smell, by the way, wasn't some background function. It was front and center. Smell was tied to moral character, to hygiene, to divine favor. The cleaner you smelled, the closer you were to the gods. The worse you reeked, the closer you were to being, well, uninvited. One mainstream historical fact we do know is that the ancient Persians valued cleanliness obsessively, in contrast to some of their Greek contemporaries, who thought sweat was a sign of virtue. The Persians, they bathed often, oiled the body after, and even perfumed their beards. Yes, beards. That thick, bushy facial hair. You couldn't just let it sit there collecting camel dust. Speaking of animals, here's a quirky tidbit. Persian nobles sometimes perfumed their horses. Not a lot. Just enough to make a political point as they trotted into public ceremonies. Imagine the message. Even my steed smells like heaven. How about your family, Cyrus? The commoners, of course, didn't live in the same olfactory universe. Most people couldn't afford imported ingredients like frankincense or civet musk. Instead, they relied on herbs like mint, sage, and crushed rose petals. Still pleasant, but not royal. You stroll farther into the palace now. The walls are inlaid with turquoise and gold, but what really stuns you is the air. It's never still. Attendants burn specific incense blends in rhythmic intervals. The recipes are secret, family protected, empire guarded, sometimes only whispered from priest to prince. One blend, used during diplomatic visits, supposedly included dried orange peel, pomegranate flower, and powdered pearl. Yes, powdered pearl. Because smelling expensive wasn't enough. You had to smell impossibly expensive. Some scholars believe that certain rulers, Darius the Great among them, would commission signature scents. Imagine a kind of early cologne developed exclusively for one individual. Of course, these perfumes didn't come in spray bottles. They came in alabaster jars, tightly sealed and sometimes guarded like royal treasure. And speaking of treasure, let's pause and picture the storerooms. Not dusty armories, but fragrance vaults. Dark, cool chambers where oils aged like fine wine. One traveler's scroll from centuries later describes rooms thick with sealed bottles, each labeled in a language not even the palace scribes could read. Real or exaggerated? Historians still argue whether such descriptions were factual or poetic flourishes written to impress Persian patrons. But here's the fun part. It wasn't just about smelling nice. Perfume in ancient Persia was a form of literacy. Knowing what scent to wear, when to wear it, how to pair it with your speech or your posture, that was political finesse. Think of it like scent-based diplomacy. Even punishments might involve smell. One fringe theory suggests that disgraced courtiers weren't just exiled, they were denied access to palace oils. A subtle but brutal exile from scent itself. Suddenly, you're a man of dust, not of saffron. So as you settle into this strange, fragrant world, remember, every breath you take here is curated, designed. It's not just about beauty. It's about survival. In a place where everyone is watching with their noses. You move deeper into the heart of the empire, and the scent grows warmer, richer. The trail of incense shifts from sweet and floral to something smokier, spicier. You're not in the palace anymore. You're in a fire temple now. The flames are low, reverent, steady, and the air is almost sacred with stillness. Here, scent isn't just decoration, it's divinity. In Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of ancient Persia, fragrance was not merely a luxury or even a health practice. It was spiritual currency. Fire, the symbol of truth and purity, burned constantly in temples, fed by bundles of clean wood and sweet-smelling herbs. Worshippers believed that the gods would be reached not just by prayer, but through smoke, scented smoke, to be precise. Historians still argue whether Zoroaster himself prescribed the use of specific incense blends, or whether these rituals developed gradually through priestly tradition. Either way, the link between purity of soul and purity of air was deeply ingrained. To smell good was to be good, and vice versa. A putrid odor wasn't just unpleasant. It was a moral failing. Imagine yourself standing quietly in the dim glow of a temple courtyard. You see a high priest or magi, robed in white linen, slowly circling the sacred fire. He's carrying a bronze censer, and from it trails a ribbon of smoke, delicate but persistent. You catch hints of saffron and benzoin resin, maybe even crushed apricot kernel, though you wouldn't dare lean in to sniff. This is a moment of spiritual maintenance, like flossing for soul. No singing, no dancing, just scent, smoke, and stillness. And it's not only the temples. Private homes had their rituals, too. In elite households, families would light fragrant coals in the morning, not just to start the day, but to ward off DJ, the forces of falsehood and chaos. A little religious aromatherapy, if you will. Here's a quirky little tidbit. Zoroastrian burial practices avoided decaying smells entirely. Corpses were not buried or burned. Instead, they were placed in dakmas, open-air towers where vultures consumed the bodies. Why? Because decomposition and the smells it brought were seen as impure. Even death had to be scent-free. You start to notice a pattern. The connection between smell and control, whether it's spiritual purity, royal influence, or even social etiquette. Everything olfactory seems tied to a larger message, and those messages were rarely subtle. Let's say you were hosting a marriage ceremony. The standard protocol? Guests entered through scented smoke. It was more than hospitality. It was a purification ritual. You weren't just walking into a home. You were crossing a scented threshold between the mundane and the ceremonial. And these rituals scaled all the way up. In Persepolis, grand festivals like Nowruz, the Persian New Year, filled the entire palace complex with fragrance. Every hall burned a different resin. One room was dedicated to dried citrus and rose. Another, ambergris and cedar. It was like walking through a perfume calendar. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some early Greek accounts, particularly from Herodotus, describe Persian fragrance habits with barely concealed judgment. They called the Persians over-perfumed, effeminate, or soft. Classic Greek shade. But here's the funny thing. Those same Greek writers would go on to adopt Persian grooming habits back home. Hypocrisy never smelled so good. Historians still debate whether the Achaemenid use of fragrance was unique in scope or just better documented than similar customs in places like India or China. What is clear is that Persian scent culture was unusually systematic, almost bureaucratic. Certain scents were scheduled, seasonal, even hierarchical. You didn't just wear a fragrance, you were assigned one, and these assignments mattered. Scholars believe that lower-ranking court officials had restricted access to oils, sort of like a Senate caste system. Your rank determined whether you wore spikenard or sesame, myrrh or mint, and if you dared to climb the social ladder wearing the wrong fragrance, let's just say you'd be sniffed out very quickly. Now let's zoom out. While you're standing in this fragrant temple, breathing in the sacred air, picture an entire empire running on this logic. From fire temples to provincial satraps, from nomadic horsemen, perfume kings. It's all connected by scent, and that scent wasn't always imported. Persia had its own aromatic resources. Rose valleys in the west, saffron fields in the northeast, and coastal traders who brought back oils from India and the Arabian Peninsula. Frankincense from Oman, cinnamon from Ceylon, and yes, even the occasional block of whale vomit from the Red Sea. That's ambergris, by the way. It smells oddly wonderful once it ages. Really, it's around this point in the story when modern readers start thinking, how did anyone get anything done in a world so obsessed with smell? And the answer is, very carefully. These scents weren't distractions, they were signals. They said, I belong, or I'm powerful, or occasionally, I just came from a temple, don't touch me. So the next time you light a candle or spritz a bit of perfume before a date, remember, you're continuing a tradition thousands of years old. A tradition where every note of scent, from citrus top to musk base, once held political, spiritual, and cultural weight. And now, as the temple fire dwindles and the air cools, you step out into the moonlight. The smell of burnt myrrh clings softly to your robes. You don't feel sweaty. You feel important. Holy even, but don't get too comfortable. The next place we're heading, that's where the real scent politics begin. You walk from a temple under a pale evening sky. Stars just beginning to blink open above the Persian plateau. The ground crunches softly beneath your sandals. Gravel perfumed with crushed herbs. On purpose. Naturally. Even the roads want to smell like someone of importance just passed by. And now you're nearing the throne room. Don't get nervous. Or, well, do. Everyone else is. The Achaemenid court was no casual affair. It was high drama in slow motion. Protocols, costumes, coded glances, and above all else, a carefully choreographed cloud ascent. When you entered the royal court, you weren't just presenting your case or tribute or awkwardly expensive gift. You were stepping into a theater of smell, where every aroma had been rehearsed, layered, and strategically placed. Let's set the stage. The throne room itself, immense echoing, designed more for awe than acoustics, is dressed in rich fabrics, carved cedar beams, and polished stone floors. You see guards in embroidered tunics, standing like statues, their hair faintly glistening from scented oil. The room smells of cypress, musk, and something else. Something sharp and citrusy that cuts through the weight of it all, just enough to keep you alert. You haven't even seen the king yet. Now here's a mainstream historical fact to ground us. The Achaemenid court had extremely formal etiquette. Subjects were expected to cover their mouths when speaking, bow deeply, and never make direct eye contact with the king unless invited. You were to approach like a humble breeze, not a storm. But scent? That was a different kind of communication. A permitted whisper in an otherwise silent space. Historians still argue whether specific perfumes were assigned to different levels of royalty. Some say Darius the Great had a signature blend, bitter orange, rose, and civet musk. Others think perfumes were seasonal, rotated like royal wardrobes. Spring might smell of saffron and hyacinth, while winter reeked gently of myrrh and cinnamon. You shuffle forward, heart thumping like a festival drum, and you notice something odd. A low table near the throne piled with unlit incense. Not burning, just resting. Each piece is carefully labeled, perhaps by origin or recipe. This is part of the political theater. 2. One for an emissary scroll recounts that Persian kings would sometimes sniff a new incense sample mid-audience, casually remarking on its strength or balance, while their scribes watched the gifter's reaction with hawk-like intensity. A royal could make or break an entire trade deal. Imagine that. You've traveled hundreds of miles, lugging jars of rare oil on camelback, only for the king to wrinkle his nose and say, "Too woody." Just like that, your province's funding? Canceled. It sounds dramatic, but that's because it was in Persia. Perfume was performance. It reinforced the power structure. You could smell the hierarchy before you even saw it. Visitors from lands like Babylon or India were often overwhelmed, not just by the grandeur, but by the sensory saturation. And then there were the rituals of anointment. Before any major decree, battle, or festival, the king might be anointed by a court priest, not just with oil, but with perfume-laced oil, thick and slow, smooth over his hands, face, maybe even his sandals. Each ingredient was symbolic. Saffron for clarity, galbanum for protection, rose for favor with the divine. One slightly fringe account even claims that before royal marriages, the entire bridal chamber would be perfumed for days in advance. Steam tents were set up with boiling pots of floral water and wood resins. The result? A room that practically sweated scent. Romantic? Maybe. Overwhelming? Almost definitely. You step a little closer to the throne now. Don't worry, you're just imagining it. The king doesn't see you. He's too busy being the olfactory axis of a vast empire. And yes, he knows how he smells. Don't think for a moment it's accidental. His robes are pre-scented, his throne cushions air with aromatic herbs, and even his ceremonial scrolls are brushed lightly with oil so that the smell of diplomacy clings to every word. There's a story, likely apocryphal, but delicious anyway, about a visiting dignitary who fainted after the king waved a perfumed fan in his direction, not from poison, just from too much fragrance. That or nerves, or both, and you start to notice something else. The scent is not just on the king, it's in the air itself. The architecture of the room was designed to hold aroma. High ceilings let the smoke rise, settle, then circulate. Hidden burners along the base of the walls keep a low-level fragrance moving constantly, never overpowering, just persistent. Some believe this was intentional, that the entire experience of audience with the king was engineered like a sensory opera. And like any good opera, the scent had an overture, a climax, and a fading coda. But scent could also signal trouble. On rare occasions, and especially smoky incense, usually one associated with mourning or divine wrath, might be burned mid-meeting. A warning. You come close to offending the crown, it said. Tread carefully. Of course, no one would say that out loud. That would be uncouth. Here's a light joke to balance the tension. If you were smart, you probably brought a backup bottle of something neutral. A peace offering for the king's nose. Because let's face it, if you can't win your argument, maybe you can win his sinuses. As you finally take your place in the imagined chamber, seated far from the throne, but close enough to catch the drift of sandalwood and rose, you begin to realize something. This wasn't just a king. This was a living perfume bottle with a crown. An emperor not just of land and people, but of scented air. A ruler whose fragrance outlasted his footsteps, whose presence filled the room long after he departed. And just as you begin to grow comfortable in this velvet cloud of diplomacy and divine favor, a soft bell chimes from somewhere beyond the court. The audience ends. The scent remains. You step out of the throne room like someone waking from a daydream. Except this one smells like a spice market in springtime. The weight of it lingers. Every thread of your robe, every strand of your hair, now carries the faint memory of royal sandalwood and sacred saffron. Whether you met the king or just passed his incense trail, you'll leave scented. That was the point. But don't go washing it off just yet. You barely scratched the surface of the Achaemenid perfume strategy. Now it's time to explore where that sensory theater really peaked. The full-body experience that was a royal festival. Imagine a gathering of nobles, officials, emissaries, and extended family, all packed into great halls and garden pavilions of Persepolis for an occasion like Nowruz, the Persian New Year. It wasn't just about food, music, and flattery. It was about immersion. Every space, every person, every surface was carefully designed to smell like a different chapter in the empire's story. You begin at the entrance. Grand archways garlanded in fresh herbs and citrus peels. Burners line the steps. As you pass through, a soft stream of spikenard smoke curls into your path. Like a butler in aromatic form, you're not just attending. You're entering a narrative. Once inside, there's no mistaking the event's structure. Each room or courtyard is a scent zone, based on theme, province, or intended emotional effect. Some are lush with rose water fountains, their vapor rising in plumes so delicate it's like walking through the ghost of a garden. Others are moody and mysterious, dark woods, thick resins, and perfume sourced from the empire's easternmost edges. One room smells entirely of citrus and mint, a rare, refreshing combination meant to awaken the inner lion, or so the inscription says. Historians still argue whether these scent designs were ceremonial, psychological, or political theater. Probably all three. There's a scroll fragment from a court visitor, a Greek, slightly cranky, who wrote, "In Persia, a man may lose his sense of balance before his sense of smell." Not a compliment, but maybe a backhanded one. Because it's true, these celebrations were strategic sensory overload. Even the food joined in. It wasn't just about taste. It was smell forward, with dishes like saffron-rubbed lamb, spiced stews thick with coriander and cinnamon, and desserts glazed in rose water and honey. You could smell the feast 3 courtyards away, long before a bite ever reached your lips. But let's pause and zoom in on one element that often gets overlooked. Clothing. Royal garments weren't just dyed, stitched, or embroidered. They were scented. Deliberately. Garment closets were ventilated with scented steam, and linen storage chests were packed with dried lavender and citrus rinds. One noblewoman's robe might carry the scent of wild jasmine, while a general's tunic smelled of leather and bitter herbs, battle scent, they called it. There's a quirky tidbit for you. Soldiers, especially those in ceremonial roles, were given perfumed armbands soaked in with oil and dusted with crushed cloves, not only to mask the smell of, let's say, heavy armor wear, but to evoke valor and discipline. A scented soldier is a serious soldier. And what about gifts? Perfume was more than welcome. It was expected. Delegates from far-off lands would bring vials of exotic oils, sometimes labeled with the name of the river or mountain they came from. A blend of frankincense and crushed apricot from the Caspian coast. A cinnamon sesame elixir from Bactria. The more poetic the origin story, the better. Of course, everyone knew that certain gifts were performative. If you brought a perfume known to be difficult to produce, the message was clear. My region is rich, cultured, and obedient. If you brought a scent that mimicked the king's own blend, the message was subtler. I understand your tastes. Please don't invade us. At some festivals, gifts would be burned publicly, not as a rejection, but as a symbolic offering to the divine. The smoke would rise into the air, mixed with the hundreds of other scents already hovering above the courtyards, and create a kind of invisible treaty. Historians still debate whether these public scent burnings were religious rituals, loyalty tests, or simply a way to keep everyone from re-gifting last year's perfume. Probably, again, all three. And if you think all this was for the elite only, think again. Even commoners had their own scent strategies during festival time. Vendors sold cheap, but cheerful perfume oils in ceramic vials. Children carried herb pouches tied to their belts. Little sachets of crushed mint, marigold, and dried plum blossom. Not expensive, but effective. The city would become a bubble of scent, where every alleyway whispered something fragrant. Even animals were in on it. Camels in festal processions were brushed with oil, their saddles rubbed down with resin. Chickens? Less so, but the royal hunting dogs? Oh, they reeked of cedar and pride. One fun, if slightly weird, practice. Some nobles would hire scent attendants, men or women whose job was to refresh the perfumed items in their chambers and clothes. Like living Glade plug-ins, they moved discreetly through the estate, restocking incense, refilling vials, and adjusting floral bundles. Talk about job security. Now imagine this all together. Hundreds of people, each carrying their own signature scent. Rooms layered with competing fragrance schemes. Food that smells like a poem. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the king, perfectly centered in a personal weather system of musk, citrus, and baked bread. You're dizzy, not in a bad way, in a dreamy way, like floating in a field of spices and silk. You could lie down in the rose petal aisle and never move again. But before you do, follow that narrow hall on your left. See the torchlight flickering down there? That leads to another world entirely. The scent isn't for celebration anymore. It's for secrecy. You follow the narrow hallway, the festival scents fading behind you with every step. The corridor grows dimmer, quieter. The air changes too. Less floral, more earthy. A trace of smoke lingers. Not celebratory smoke, but dry, restrained, almost medicinal, like a whisper of cedar locked in a library. This is the undercurrent of the empire, the trade routes that made all this scented splendor possible. Before there could be perfumed emperors or rose-soaked festivals, there had to be routes, roads, caravans, and men who risked sunstroke, scorpions, and desert bandits just to transport 3 jars of myrrh. In other words, scent wasn't just about style. It was an infrastructure. You emerged now into a low-walled courtyard near the outer edge of the palace complex, where traders once gathered. No perfume fountains here. Just stone benches, brass scales, and the faint scent of dried herbs, leftovers from deals long settled. A few worn camel bells clink in the wind. Let's ground ourselves in a mainstream historical fact. The Persian Empire was home to one of the most sophisticated trade networks of the ancient world. The Royal Road, a nearly 1,700-mile route from Sardis to Susa, connected the western and eastern edges of the empire. While it's often mentioned for its speed, couriers could cross the empire in days. It was also a Senate artery. Every station along that road offered different goods, but among the most prized, fragrant materials. Incense resins, flower oils, dried petals, and rare spices that could be crushed into perfumes or burned as offerings. These were currency in both economics and etiquette. Historians still argue whether the trade of scent was officially regulated by the empire or left in the hands of merchant guilds. What's clear is that fragrance was a high-stakes commodity, carried in fragile jars wrapped in wool, wax sealed against heat, and often guarded as fiercely as gold. And, oh, the places they came from. Let's take a quick olfactory road trip, shall we? From the south came frankincense, resin tapped from scraggly trees, clinging to cliffs in what is now Oman and Yemen, harvested by hand, dried in the sun, then packed tightly and carried north. From the east, Sandalwood and cinnamon floated in from India, sometimes via river, sometimes on the backs of elephants. The scent of rain-drenched wood and spicy bark. From the west, lavender and sage in the Anatolian highlands, more subtle, but just as valuable. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Persians used onion-shaped bottles to transport oils, believing the shape prevented evil spirits from entering the scent. Did it work? Hard to say. But you have to admit, they were very committed to quality control. Some perfumes were so rare, they were named after their trade route. Desert Thread was a blend that supposedly picked up the scent of every campfire, flower field, and temple it passed on its journey. Was it poetic branding or an actual scent blend? Historians still argue about that one. And where there was perfume, there was power play. Certain provinces were known specifically for their scent contributions. To fall out of favor with the court could mean losing trade access. No more rare cinnamon for your satrapy, which, in courtly language, was the olfactory equivalent of being sent to bed without dinner. Merchants, for their part, became fluent in smell politics. You might not speak Old Persian, but if you could identify 12 scent samples blindfolded, you'd be hired on the spot. Apprenticeship in the perfume trade often began with scent memorization games. Close your eyes, sniff this oil, now name where it came from, which season, and whether it's fresh or spoiled. If you got it wrong, no deal. Come back next solstice. Imagine now a caravan winding its way through the Zagros Mountains. Dozens of camels, crates stacked high with amphorae, the air filled with mixture of sweat, dried apricots, and that faint, delicious smell of distant riches. These journeys weren't just about movement. They were about preserving scent across hundreds of miles. To keep the fragrances pure, traders used everything from beeswax seals to double-wrapped goat bladders. Sounds gross, smell divine, and sometimes perfumes weren't transported in liquid at all. They were baked into clay discs or absorbed into cloth, which could later be soaked to extract the scent. Travelers even wore scented rings, tiny hollow trinkets filled with resinous paste, so they could offer samples without opening a single jar. But trade wasn't always legal or peaceful. Smuggling? Oh, yes. There's a fascinating side trail through Persian history that leads to fragrance contraband. Certain blends were reserved for royalty and banned from civilian sale. Naturally, that only made them more desirable. So underground traders developed elaborate methods for sneaking rare perfumes past customs. False bottom baskets, hollow scrolls, even camels whose fur had been scent infused, then scraped for extraction later. It was a whole underground world of black market musk and forbidden floral blends. Think of it as the perfume cartel of the ancient Near East, less violent, but a lot more fragrant. You lean against a sun-warmed stone pillar now, letting the echoes of hooves and laughter fade into the air. That little patch of mint growing at your feet, not for tea. It was likely grown to freshen trade courtyards, masking the less pleasant aromas of long-distance transport. So yes, the king smelled wonderful, but it took thousands of hands, hundreds of beasts, dozens of sleepless journeys, and a couple of clever smugglers to make it happen. And now that you know where the scents came from, it's time to meet the ones who bent the rules to move them. You follow the scent trail again, but this time it winds off the main road, away from palaces and formalities, into the shadowy alleys of ancient Persian cities. Gone are the incense burners and gold-stamped amphorae. Instead, You're ducking behind textile stalls, stepping over scattered figs, and pausing in front of a bakery that smells a little too sweet to be selling just bread. Because this is where the black market blooms. The secret side of the perfume empire, smuggling. Every thriving trade system eventually grows a mirror version in the dark, and Persia, scent-soaked and status-hungry, was no exception. While the empire tried to control the supply and symbolism of its most coveted fragrances, there were always people willing to bend the rules, and you just stepped into their world. First, let's get one mainstream historical fact out of the way. Several high-value substances in ancient Persia were state-controlled. This included precious woods, incense resins, and especially perfumes crafted in the royal laboratories. You couldn't just roll up to the local apothecary and buy King's Blend No. 3. That formula was under lock and key, likely passed down within a very small circle of trusted artisans. But humans being humans, the more you lock something up, the more someone wants it. And so, a shadow economy took root, delicate, discreet, and surprisingly creative. Historians still argue whether this black market perfume trade had formal organization or was just a loose web of rogue traders, corrupt scribes, and opportunistic mule drivers. But what agreed on is that certain port cities became known for their aromatic loopholes. Take Hormuz, for instance, ostensibly a salt trading port. But visit the right stall at the wrong hour, and you might be handed a packet of spice wool, euphemism for contraband perfume oil woven into fabric, soaked in oil, dried, folded, and smuggled under layers of actual wool. Genius, right? You walk past a row of modest homes now, the kind with sun-bleached clay walls and quiet courtyards. Someone is boiling lentils. Someone else is brushing rose water onto a doorframe, either for luck or to signal that the perfume man has arrived. That's how the illegal blends moved, through signs and smells. A sudden whiff of cinnamon in a butcher's stall might mean, ask about the shipment. A splash of sandalwood on a prayer rug might hint that your delivery is ready. Not messages written in ink, but messages written in air. Here's a quirky little tidbit. One popular method of smuggling involved hollowed reeds. Traders would fill long sticks of dried bamboo with perfume, cork the ends with wax, and label the bundles as fishing tools. No one questioned it, until a clumsy guard tried to use one and walked away smelling like a pomegranate tree in bloom. Even animals played their part. Certain smugglers trained carrier pigeons to fly between temples or towns with tiny perfume pouches tied to their legs. The pouches weren't meant to carry large volumes, just enough to prove a blend's authenticity, a scent sample to seal a deal, and the scents themselves, not just copies. Many of these underground blends were inventions, original recipes designed to echo royal perfumes without outright duplicating them. A little more cumin here, a little less rose there, something floral but unfamiliar, something rich, but just different enough to slip under the imperial radar. You pause at a low archway, barely noticeable unless you're looking for it. A worn curtain hangs over the entrance, and behind it, you catch the unmistakable trace of frankincense mixed with date syrup. Not a typical pairing. That's the calling card of a well-known scent smuggler, according to one traveler's log from centuries later. The blend was a signature, a scented fingerprint left on every shipment. Of course, the Empire didn't take kindly to this side hustle. There are records, some exaggerated, some very real, of courtiers being stripped of title or coin after being caught with unsanctioned fragrance. A royal edict even warned of perfumes unblessed by the flame, a poetic way of saying, if it didn't come from the temple or palace, it's not legal. Still, the trade continued. You can't really stop something that smells as good. Historians still debate how deep the corruption went. Did royal scribes leak recipes? Did soldiers look the other way in exchange for a free vial? Was the queen herself wearing a black market blend one Nuraz? Just to be daring? We may never know, but we do know that the underground perfume scene had its own elite. A few names, half real, half legendary, have survived through folk stories and dusty fragments. There's Nasana of Ecbatana, said to blend 7 herbs into a single drop of oil that made even palace guards weep. Or the Black-Nosed Boy, a courier who could identify fake ingredients by scent alone, even with a cloth over his eyes. Were they real? Partially. Probably. Maybe not. But doesn't it smell like a good story either way? You turn down another lane, and for a moment, you lose the scent trail. Just heat and dust and the quiet buzz of cicadas. And then there it is, a whisper of cardamom, faint but clear. Someone is distilling something nearby. Illegally, beautifully. The air in this part of the city is alive with risk and innovation. The smugglers may not have worn crowns, but they shaped the olfactory history of Persia just as much as the kings. They added chaos to order, invention to tradition. They kept the empire's nose on its toes. And as you step out of that alley, back into the better lit streets, you can't help but think, sometimes the best things don't come through the front door. You leave the narrow alley behind, stepping back into the gentle glow of torchlight. The city is quieter now. The festival buzz has mellowed into murmurs. But the scent? It lingers, carried on silk sleeves, caught in braided hair, and tucked under fingernails. Even as the city exhales, the perfumes remain. You head toward a quieter part of town now, past courtyards filled with whispering water and shaded colonnades. This is the women's quarter of a noble household. And if you think the politics of perfume stopped at the palace gates, think again. Because here, in shaded rooms behind carved doors, another kind of olfactory power was being practiced. Domestic diplomacy, personal status, and a kind of soft influence only scent can deliver. You're about to discover just how central perfume was to the private lives of Persian women. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. Elite Persian women often wielded considerable cultural and social authority, especially within their households. While men held most official political roles, the women of noble families managed estates, patronized artists, educated children, and curated incredible private fragrance rituals. Perfume wasn't just something women wore. It was something they crafted, traded, gifted, and guarded. You step into one of these women's apartments now. The floors are cool stone, strewn with soft rugs. There's a copper brazier in the center, its coals long gone cold, but still faintly spiced with clove. Hanging from the ceiling, dried bundles of herbs, lavender, basil, rose hips, tied with red thread and positioned to dry just right. This is a private perfume lab, cleverly disguised as a sitting room. On a low wooden table sits a glass vial of attar, its stopper covered in beeswax. You lean in, just one breath, and you're enveloped in something deeply floral, warm, and rich. The kind of scent that speaks without words. The kind that turns heads at court, but whispers seductively at home. Historians still argue whether noble women made their own perfumes or employed full-time perfumers within their households. Likely both. What's clear is that women curated scent wardrobes the way some people collect jewelry. One blend for waking, one for guests, one for bedtime, and one for seduction. Sometimes they were stored in ceramic pots. Other times, in delicately carved ivory boxes passed down like heirlooms. Here's a quirky little tidbit. Persian wedding dowries often include a full scent chest, a wooden case lined with silk compartments for rose water, clove oil, amber paste, and tiny brass funnels for mixing. One noted marriage contract even demanded that a bride bring 3 scents for comfort and 1 for persuasion. A practical and poetic request. Now, let's talk about influence. A well-perfumed woman wasn't just admired, she was remembered. Gossip and alliances flowed through scented courtyards and incense-laced salons. A noble woman might accidentally leave her personal fragrance on a royal cushion after a visit. Subtle as a feather, but potent as politics. And remember, these perfumes weren't mass-produced. They were signature blends developed over years. Recipes were passed secretly between mothers and daughters, altered slightly with each generation to reflect new access to ingredients or shifting tastes. A few noble women even branded their oils with unique names, the earliest hint of what we now call a personal brand. There's even record of one aristocratic woman who named her signature blend the breath before spring. Apparently, it combined hyacinth, dried peach skin, and a tiny dash of vinegar to sharpen the sweetness. Risky? Maybe. Memorable? Definitely. Of course, these practices weren't limited to the elites. Common women, too, had their own scent rituals, simpler but no less meaningful. They soaked orange peels in olive oil. They tucked marigold petals in their shawls. They lined their doorways with mint, not for status, but for comfort, for identity, for joy. In some villages, women gathered monthly to trade herbs and oils, sharing new recipes and old tricks. One folk remedy claimed that massaging your feet with sesame oil and thyme before bed would lead to prophetic dreams. Another said placing rose water under your pillow could soften a stubborn husband's heart. Results may have varied. And then there was motherhood. New mothers were bathed in lightly scented water to aid healing and calm the child. Babies were gently anointed with oil blends thought to ward off illness and, according to one sweet superstition, make the soul smell sweet enough for angels. Historians still debate how much of this olfactory culture came from Persia itself versus earlier Mesopotamian or Elamite traditions. But regardless of origin, by the time of the Achaemenids, the practice was fully woven into the social fabric. You take a seat in the corner of the room now, out of the way, invisible. You watch a young woman prepare her evening scent. She uncorks a jar, dips her fingers into something amber-colored, and dabs it behind her ears at the base of her neck and, interestingly, on the soles of her feet. She then breathes it in deeply like a prayer. This is more than grooming. This is centering, anchoring herself in a scent she knows, one that reminds her who she is, what she wants, and maybe who she might influence tomorrow at tea. And just as you're about to drift into the cushions yourself, the door creaks open. An older woman steps in. Her face is lined but warm, her robe modest, and her perfume, it fills the room with something subtle, citrusy, and deeply commanding. The air shifts around her. Conversations pause. You realize in that moment, perfume was power in powder form, quiet, invisible, but completely in control. So if you ever thought fragrance was just fluff or luxury, think again. In ancient Persia, women wore their ambition in rose and musk in time, and the air never forgot them. You rise quietly, stepping back into the cool night. The women's core fade behind you, but its scents cling: rose, thyme, amber, and something else, a sense of calm power, influence without shouting. You carry it with you now, down the long stone path toward a place where fragrance takes on yet another role. Not pleasure, not politics, but protection. You're heading into the world of ritual and religion, where every offering, every chant, every brush of oil on skin carried weight beyond this world. Because in ancient Persia, scent was sacred. Let's start with mainstream historical fact. The dominant religion during much of the Achaemenid period was Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster or Zarathustra. This ancient faith emphasized dualism: light and dark, truth and lie, good and evil. Fire played a central role in its rituals, as did purity, both physical and spiritual. Now imagine walking into a fire temple, not a grand structure like a palace, but clean and purposeful. The air is dry, almost expectant. At the center burns a sacred flame, housed in a stone basin and tended by priests. And around it, the unmistakable scent of burning incense, not just for mood, but as a physical form of prayer. Historians still argue about the exact rituals used in Zoroastrian ceremonies during the Achaemenid era. Much of what we know comes from later texts or foreign accounts. But we do know this: scent was considered a purifier. Fragrant smoke was thought to rise and carry prayers to the heavens, while also driving away unclean spirits or influences. You sit near the back of the temple now, watching as a priest in white robe sprinkles crushed halma leaves into the fire. The smoke that rises is greenish, bitter, and sharp, nothing like the warm spices of court. This scent isn't for pleasure. It's for cleansing, for clarity. There's a fringe belief, recorded in a few obscure scrolls, that certain resins could change the nature of your thoughts if inhaled during prayer. That too much myrrh could make you melancholic. That frankincense might bring divine dreams. Were these mystical claims? Medical ones? Historians still debate that too. But whatever the interpretation, the use of scent was deliberate. Every oil, every powder, every pinch of crushed root had purpose. Even the rituals of death were fragrant. When someone died, their body was often washed in rose water or lemon balm, not just for cleanliness, but to honor the soul's transition. Funerary shrouds were dusted with dried herbs, often thyme or marjoram, known for their calming properties. A small dish of burning juniper might be placed near the head of the deceased, both as an offering and a barrier against impure spirits. There's a Persian proverb from centuries later: "What is remembered is what is scented." It suggests that fragrance is a true memorial, not stone, not words. In temples, perfume oil was often stored in consecrated jars, sealed not with wax but with a ribbon of gold or silver thread. Only certain priests could open them, and only on specific days. The recipes? Lost, guarded, mythologized. Here's a quirky little fact. Some religious ceremonies involved walking through fragrance as part of purification. A participant might pass through 3 scent gates, openings hung with different herbs or resins, each with a symbolic meaning, meant for truth, sandalwood for protection, rose for remembrance. One ancient tablet even mentions a scented ladder, a symbolic climb toward enlightenment, each rung marked by a different smell. Imagine ascending from earthy myrrh to citrus, then to floral, then to something sweet and faint and barely describable. A staircase of invisible progress. You look now toward a small alcove in the temple wall, where a woman kneels, head bowed. She's holding a tiny perfume vial, turning it in her hands like a rosary. She dabs a drop behind each ear, then whispers a prayer. You don't hear the words, but the motion is clear. She's preparing herself, not for others, but for the divine. And then there were the seasonal rituals, especially around Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Fire leaping, laughter, cleansing. Homes were swept clean, old items discarded, and, most importantly, new scents were introduced. Vials of fresh perfume were unsealed. Charcoal burners were lit with new blends. The air itself was reset, meant to welcome the new year clean and fragrant. The symbolic logic? If the nose welcomed sweetness, the year would follow. You sit quietly now, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional rattle of a brass censer. The air is heavy but not oppressive, like a story about an end or a dream just beginning. And suddenly you understand. For the Persians, scent was a bridge between body and spirit, between human and divine, between the moment you entered a space and the moment you left it changed. So whether it was the sweet oil of a newborn skin, the bitter smoke of a funeral flame, or the complex perfume of a queen stepping into court, every scent had something to say. You just had to be quiet enough to hear it. You step outside the fire temple, your senses still humming with smoke and silence. But the night isn't done with you yet. A soft breeze curls down from the hills, carrying a scent that feels familiar, but you can't quite place it. Something sweet, earthy, and slightly damp, like rain in a garden that hasn't seen water in months. You follow it. It leads you beyond the palace walls, past the quiet homes and empty courtyards, into the outer gardens of the city. These aren't the manicured royal displays meant for processions or festivals. No, these are working gardens, lush, layered, and carefully cultivated. And as it turns out, they were also the empire's secret perfume laboratories. Let's ground ourselves in a mainstream historical fact. The Achaemenid Persians were masterful gardeners. They didn't just grow food, they designed spaces for beauty, reflection, and utility. These were the famed paradisa, walled gardens that gave us the very word paradise. And nestled within those paradises, rows upon rows of fragrant plants, each chosen not just for its look or yield, but for its scent. Rose, saffron, sweet basil, violet, wild mint, coriander, fennel, myrtle, iris root, and countless others we might never fully identify. It wasn't just a collection. It was a living library of fragrance, an olfactory archive, constantly in bloom. You crouch near a patch of damask roses, their petals just beginning to unfurl in the moonlight. The smell is gentle but deep, like memories softened by time. And here's a quirky tidbit. Those roses were often picked before sunrise, when their oil content was at its peak. Not by nobles, but by skilled harvesters, mostly women, who knew exactly when and how to pluck a flower without bruising its scent. Historians still argue whether these gardens were organized purely for aesthetics or they functioned as active supply chains for palace perfumers. But one thing's clear, The scent economy began here in the dirt, with knees bent and hands stained with pollen. A gardener steps into view now, an older man with a linen wrap around his head and a curved bronze knife tucked into his belt. He doesn't see you, of course. You're not really here, but you watch him tend to a row of calamus stalks, slicing the roots with practiced care. Calamus smells spicy and sharp, almost medicinal. It was used not only in perfumes, but also in mouthwashes, balms, and allegedly love potions. Versatile stuff. The garden isn't quiet either. It's alive with layers of scent, each unfolding on top of the other like overlapping musical notes. There's a warm punch of saffron, the tart greenness of unripe pomegranates, and floating somewhere between earth and sky, the powdery ghost of iris root being dried on flat stones nearby. You trail the gardener to a small wooden shed at the far end of the garden. Inside is a rudimentary distillation setup. Ceramic vessels, coiled copper tubing, charred remains would use for heating. Simple but effective. This is where experimentation happened, where someone, somewhere, first thought to mix mint with lavender or to steep orange blossoms in sesame oil for 12 days instead of 10. And sometimes experimentation went delightfully wrong. One scroll fragment mentions a failed attempt to create a scent of lightning. The perfumer tried combining crushed quartz with charred figs and pepper oil. The result? Extremely pungent and not recommended near candles. You have to admire the ambition. But gardens weren't just perfume factories. They were philosophical spaces. The act of tending to scent-producing plants was seen as noble, even meditative. It connected the grower to the rhythms of nature, to cycles of bloom and decay. There's even a line from a court poet that reads, "He who knows as basil knows the breath of kings." That breath, of course, had come from somewhere, and that somewhere was here. A quiet little grove in the moonlight, a garden that smells like memory, medicine, and maybe just a bit of mischief. You follow a stepping stone path now, deeper into the foliage. A vine of honeysuckle brushes your sleeve. Somewhere, an owl calls out. You pause beside a small pool where petals float like little boats, ferrying their scent from one moment to the next. Historians still debate how much these garden perfumes influence Persian poetry, but the overlap is undeniable. The metaphors of love, longing, and ephemerality all lean heavily on scent. The rose that blooms too soon, the perfume that fades at dawn, the lover who lingers like more on the skin. You could write a whole love letter in fragrances alone. And speaking of love, these gardens were also where secret meetings happened, where oil-slick letters were passed hand to hand, where nobles and artists and priests could briefly forget the stiffness of rank and speak in the language of petals and steam. You close your eyes now and let it all rise around you. The hiss of heated water, the sticky sweetness of crushed fruit rind, the herbal by the bay leaves bruised underfoot. This isn't a garden anymore. It's a symphony of scent, a place where power begins in silence, where influence grows in root beds, and where every breeze carries a trace of something ancient and deliberate. You breathe in, you smile, and then you follow the path back toward the city, wondering, what did a garden smell like after a rainstorm? The garden disappears behind you, swallowed by the dark, but its scents still cling to your sleeves, like whispered secrets you weren't meant to hear. You wander back to the winding streets toward the heart of the city, this time toward a place where power and perfume meet face to face, across polished tiles and carefully practiced gestures. You're heading to the royal court, and not just to admire its grandeur. No, you're going to study its performances, because in ancient Persia, politics was theater, and every gesture, robe, and yes, every scent played a role in the script. Let's anchor with a mainstream historical fact. The Achaemenid court was one of the most elaborate bureaucracies in the ancient world. From the moment you entered the palace, everything was protocol. There were ranks, rituals, unspoken rules, and a language of status spoken fluently in Fragrance. As you step through the marble columns of the main audience hall, the difference is immediate. The air is thick with perfume, but not cloying, layered, sophisticated, like a chorus sung in harmony. Historians still argue whether the Achaemenid kings used specific perfumes to convey different political moods, magnanimity, threat, indifference, but some evidence suggests that certain scent combinations were reserved for specific events, diplomatic receptions, religious rituals, private audiences. Right now, the king is preparing to receive an ambassador from a far-off land. You don't see him yet, but you smell him. Well, not him exactly, his presence, which arrives before he does in the form of a signature scent, a blend of saffron, ambergris, dried apricot peel, and something faintly resinous you can't name. It's a quiet power move. This wasn't random. Court perfumers, yes, that was a real job, designed these blend with intention. They combined rare ingredients from the far reaches of the empire, subtly reminding guests of Persia's wealth, reach, and elegance. Each perfume was a message written in oil and ash. Here's a quirky little tidbit. In one preserved court manual, there's mention of scent choreography. Attendants were instructed to release different incense blends in a timed sequence during audiences, beginning with grounding myrrh, moving to bright citrus, and finishing with sweet sandalwood, like a perfume crescendo. And the king himself? He didn't apply perfume like a common man. Oh no. You glance across the hall to a small alcove where two servants are warming tiny gold ladles over a brazier. Inside them, pellets of perfumed wax begin to melt. Once liquefied, the wax is brushed onto the king's robes using peacock feathers, believed to distribute scent without damaging the fabric. Royal scent, applied by a royal bird. Naturally, the ambassador arrives now. He bows, steps forward, and just before speaking, pauses to inhale. He's trying to read the room the way you might read a tone of voice. Is this the warm perfume of welcome, or the dry spice of formality? He smiles. It's the former. You watch the exchange play out, but your attention lingers on a nearby eunuch, dressed in white, holding a small ivory box. Inside, emergency scent tablets, compressed bundles of dried herbs and wax that could be burned, crushed, or dissolved in wine, depending on the moment's needs. Think of it as a diplomatic Swiss Army knife. Unexpected tension in the room, crush a tablet of mint and rose. Need energize the crowd? Burn a cinnamon clove pellet. A little mood control via nostril. Historians still debate whether these perfumed interludes had a measurable effect on diplomacy. But let's be honest, who's going to start a war when the room smells like lemon blossom and honey? And the courtiers? They weren't just spectators. Their rank determined their scent. High nobles were assigned blends incorporating more costly ingredients, musk, civet, rare wood oils. Lower-ranked officials were restricted to simpler herbs. This scent hierarchy created an invisible order within the visible court. You didn't just look important. You smelled it, In one satirical poem from the era, a minor courtier complains that his rosewater blend was so thin, even the cats ignored it. Court humor was dry, apparently, and perfume wasn't just for the living. In this very hall, you might see the remnants of an offering to a former king's memory, a small silver censer burning the same scent that was used at his coronation, not as a sad farewell, but as a reminder. The fragrance of his rule still lingers, quite literally. You drift now toward the outer edge of the hall, where scribes are recording the meeting. Even their ink smells faintly of orris root, not for luxury, but amassed the scent of iron gall and animal glue. Even bureaucracy had its bouquet. Here's another delightfully nerdy tidbit. One official perfume was supposedly used only during royal tax announcements. Why? The blend of lemon balm and honey was said to soften the numbers. Did it work? Well, historians still argue, but perhaps the most striking part of all this olfactory theater is its subtlety. No one points to the incense and says, "This is our power." No one announces, "Here is our empire's mood in oil form." It's just there, layered into the walls, lingering on the silk, hanging in the corners like shadows. And yet it does its job, because in a court of whispers, robes, and protocols so intricate they make your head spin, perfume was clarity. It told you who held sway, what kind of day it was, and whether you were welcome. As the ambassador bows and takes his leave, the room exhales. A servant douses the incense burner. Another sweeps rose petals from the threshold. The audience is over, but the scent remains. You slip away from the throne room before the scent fades entirely, your head still spinning from all that silent pageantry. The halls echo behind you, murmurs, silk brushing stone, the last wisps of amber and citrus trailing through the air. But now, it's time to leave the palaces, the courts, and the cities behind. Tonight, you're heading out to the edges, the desert outposts, trade routes, and wandering tents where fragrance didn't just symbolize power. It was power, bargained, bartered, diluted, disguised. Because if the court was where perfume spoke in whispers, the Persian trade world was where it shouted, sang, and sometimes lied straight to your face. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. Ancient Persia sat at the crossroads of some of the most important trade networks in history, including the Silk Roads and the Royal Road, a 1,700-mile artery connecting Susa to Sardis. Along these dusty veins moved textiles, spices, ideas, and scent. Perfume ingredients were both cargo and currency. Think about it. A pinch of saffron weighed nothing, but could buy you a meal in 5 cities. A sealed jar of rose attar might be worth more than a camel. This wasn't luxury. It was liquid capital. As you walk now through a caravanserai near the empire's border, the smells are chaotic and glorious. There's the must of wool blankets, the sharpness of horse sweat, the sweetness of dried fruit, and hovering just above it all, a fine layer of fragrance dust. Crushed herbs fallen from sacks, drops of oil accidentally spilled, scent ground into floorboards. Historians still argue whether perfume traders travel with official protection or simply bribe their way through trouble. But based on what we know from fragments and merchant letters, these scent caravans were often strategically vague, labeling cypress oil as floor polish, hiding rare ambergris in sacks of salt, or sealing perfume in dry gourds and claiming it was vinegar. And yes, there were customs inspectors. Persians were ahead of their time in many ways, And border towns often had officials sniffing out tax dodgers. Literally. You picture a bored clerk uncorking a flask, frowning and muttering, "This smells like musk, not mulberry." You wander now through a makeshift marketplace outside the city of Ecbatana, where traders from as far as India, Arabia, and the Greek islands set up folding tables and patchwork tents. The scent competition is fierce. One man burns cinnamon bark in a shallow dish, drawing a crowd. A woman fans a scent of jasmine oil using a feathered fan that doubles as a price signal. One plume equals very expensive. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some itinerant traders use perfume riddles as advertising. They challenge potential buyers with questions like, "What smells like honey but never saw a bee? What grows in the desert but wilts in rain?" The answers, of course, were oils and resins, each with a story to tell and a price to match. But beyond trade, perfume also served as diplomatic glue. When envoys traveled between empires, say, from Persia to India or from Babylon to Lydia, they carried gift blends, carefully selected oils designed not just to impress, but to translate. Fragrance crossed language barriers. A sandalwood mint blend might suggest respect. A rose-violet saffron oil could signal openness, or in one case, allegedly, a marriage proposal. Nothing says, "I like your empire," like handing over a perfume that took a year to make. And then there are the frauds. You stop by a stall run by a man with suspiciously clean hands and far too many jars labeled Royal Blend. Inside one, colored water. Inside another, olive oil with crushed garlic and dried fig, pretending to be amber oil. Not exactly what you'd wear to meet the king. Counterfeit perfumes were a real problem. Some merchants even hired scent testers, usually young girls with sharp noses and reputation for honesty. If she said it smelled off, that was enough to sink the deal. If she sneezed, total disaster. And for those carrying the real deal, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Caravans were often targeted by bandits, not for gold or silk, but for scent. Some oils fetched prices 10 times higher at the edge of the empire. In one preserved letter, a merchant warns his cousin not to travel alone with those 3 vials of Syrian myrrh unless you want to meet the red jackals. You reach the edge of the outpost now, where a group of weary travelers sits around a fire. One of them, older, missing half an eyebrow, pulls out a small pouch. With great ceremony, he uncorks a tiny bottle, dips his finger, and touches it to his throat. Instantly, the air changes. Everyone leans in. It's oud, deep, smoky, rare, and utterly unmistakable. No words are spoken. The scent speaks enough. Historians still debate whether these long-distance traders saw themselves as scent curators or just savvy salesmen. But you know better. These were fragrance diplomats, people who carried power in clay jars and cotton swabs. They mapped empires not with ink, but with aroma trails. And as the firelight flickers and the oud settles into your lungs like a lullaby, you understand what they knew. That perfume wasn't just a thing you wore. It was a thing you moved through the world with. The fire burns low behind you, and the oud still lingers, smoky, complex, comforting in a way you can't quite explain. You stretch your legs, adjust your imaginary cloak, and follow the caravan road eastward, deeper into the empire. Tonight, we're leaving trade stalls and gilded courts behind for something even more intoxicating. Stories. Because in ancient Persia, Perfume wasn't only used in rituals or palaces. It lived in legends, poems, and myths, woven into the very language of memory and meaning. If you wanted someone to remember a tale for 100 years, you didn't just write it down, you perfumed it. Let's start with mainstream historical fact. Persian literary tradition is among the richest and oldest in the world. From Shahnameh to love lyrics scratched into pottery, storytelling was a national pastime. And in those stories, scent was a metaphor, a mood, a message. You find yourself now in the courtyard of a rural village, where a traveling bard has arrived just before dusk. He wears a robe stitched with patches of every city he's ever passed through. He smells faintly of horses, cedar, and something sweet, maybe cardamom oil dab behind one ear. The villagers gather. The bard clears his throat, and he begins. It's a story you've never heard before, though it sounds vaguely familiar. It's about a prince who lost his sense of smell. The tale goes like this. A young prince was cursed by a rival magician, not with blindness or silence, but with anosmia. He could no longer smell a thing. He wandered gardens and found them dull. He entered temples and felt nothing. He couldn't even detect the perfume his beloved wore to signal her secret visits. Desperate, he sought help from sages, perfumers, and even thieves. None could help, until one day, a wise woman offered him a solution. She would create for him a perfume so powerful, so true, that it would reach past the curse and wake his memory of scent. The ingredients were wild and strange. Dew from a lion's footprint, rose petals kissed by a blind moth, saffron picked at moonrise. Of course, these are metaphors, but they feel oddly real. When the prince inhaled his mythical scent, he cried for an entire day, not from sadness, but because he remembered every scent he had ever loved. The crowd is spellbound, and so are you. That's the thing about scent in Persian literature. It wasn't just decoration. It was narrative architecture. Entire poems were built around it. A character might be identified not by their deeds, but by their scent. Love interests were described as wearing the wind, cloaked in jasmine, or hidden inside an apricot tree at dusk. Historians still debate whether these metaphors were based on actual perfumes of the time or purely poetic inventions. Probably both. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Sasanian-era love poem refers to a woman's hair as woven with the smoke of 7 cities, suggesting that her scent was a composite of every land her lover had ever dreamed of. That's not just romance. That's geography in a bottle. And the metaphors didn't stop at love. Warriors were said to smell of iron and ash. Betrayers were sour with unripe dates. Death itself was described in one tale as a fragrance without name, something you recognized instantly, though no one had ever told you how it smelled. You wander now into a small village library, where scrolls are stored in clay jars to protect them from damp. One jar smells like cedar wood and crushed lavender, the ancient version of mothballs. You pull out a scroll and unroll it carefully. It's a recipe disguised as a fable. A fox seeks out a lion to gain courage, but the lion tells him, courage lies not in the body, but in the scent you leave behind. The fox then travels to 5 lands, collecting ingredients, learning to mix them not by heat or weight, but by intention. At the end, the fox returns, not stronger, but unforgettable. This scroll ends with a line that stays with you. To be remembered, scent the air behind your silence. Let that sit with you for a moment. Even the Persian mystics knew the power of fragrance. The great poet Rumi often invokes scent as a symbol for spiritual truth, something invisible, fleeting, and yet completely overwhelming when it touches you at the right time. He once wrote, "What you seek is seeking you, like the rose seeks its morning perfume." You pause beside a stall selling tiny books bound in dyed leather. One title catches your eye, The Perfumer's Book of Dreams. Inside are aphorisms, half recipes, dream interpretations, and short riddles about scent. Some are practical, others are a little out there. Dream of saffron and awaken to a visitor. Spill rose oil at night, and love will not return until spring. Smell your sleeve before speaking. Let your memory guide your mouth. There's no way to verify any of it, but somehow it all feels right. Because long before science caught up, Persians understood that scent wasn't just chemistry. It was storytelling by other means. And so you sit now beneath an olive tree, watching the stars prick the sky like tiny oil droplets on a still surface. Somewhere in the distance, another bard begins his tale. This one, you think, might smell like thunder and figs. You stay under that olive tree for a while, the sky thick with stars and soft night air. The last tale still echoes in your ears, its perfume clinging to your thoughts like a stubborn note of musk. But now you're ready to wander somewhere new, somewhere humbler, quieter, less about court politics or poetic riddles, and more about daily life. Because the truth is, the average ancient Persian wasn't a king, priest, or bard. They were farmers, potters, scribes. And yet, even in the dust and noise of everyday work, perfume had a place, as routine, comfort, superstition, and subtle self-expression. Let's start with mainstream historical fact. While historical records often focus on the elite, archaeological finds show that scented oils and fragrant herbs were used by people across classes. Even modest households had clay jars with traces of rosewater, lavender, and pine resin. You find yourself now in a small village on the fringes of the empire. The houses are made of mud brick, their roofs flat and shaded with bundles of dried reeds. Chickens cluck lazily in the distance, and everywhere you go, the scent of life lingers, sun-warmed earth with smoke, crushed herbs underfoot. In one home, a mother boils water with mint and thyme, not for illness, but just because she likes the way it makes the house feel. She says it freshens the day. Her daughter grinds dried orange peel into powder to mix with sesame oil, a homemade balm for her wrists. And the father, who works with dyes, scrubs his hands with scented ash to remove the smell of indigo. It's not glamorous, but it's real, and it smells like belonging. Here's a quirky little tidbit. In rural towns, it was common to sprinkle aromatic seeds like fennel or anise on hot coals in clay ovens. This didn't just scent the bread. It perfumed the air, the hands that kneaded the dough, and the aprons hung up at dusk. You stop by a small workshop where a weaver treats her loom threads with rosewater-infused starch. It makes the fibers easier to work with and leaves a ghost of perfume in every shawl she sells. Imagine buying fabric and months later, as you walk in the sun, catching the faintest trace of rose carried by the breeze. Historians still debate whether these everyday uses were learned from court culture or developed independently in rural settings. Either way, the end result is the same, a sensory world gently stitched together with scent. You pass a group of children now, crouched around a dusty game board drawn in the dirt. One of them holds a pouch of herb pebbles, small rocks soaked in perfumed water and dried in the sun. They use them as play currency, and sometimes crush them between stones just to release the smell again. Who needs toys when your game pieces smell like basil? And then there are the street vendors. In a nearby village market, a woman sells little cones of perfumed wax wrapped in leaves. They're not expensive, and they're not fancy, but they're good, made with local beeswax and bits of dried myrtle. People melt them near windows to ward off bad smells, or keep them in their pockets just to remind themselves of better days. You try one. It smells like lemon and smoke and something faintly green. You can't name it, but it makes you feel like everything is going to be okay. Not far off, a young couple walks home from the field. She's braided a sprig of sage into her hair. He's rubbed pine resin into his boots, not for fashion, but to keep away bugs. Still, they both catch each other's scent and smile. In this world, scent isn't about seduction or spectacle. It's about familiarity, about making something mundane just a little bit nicer. It's the difference between coming home and feeling at home. You sit now on a low wall, listening to the thump of a mortar and pestle somewhere nearby. Someone's grinding asafoetida, a pungent spice used in cooking and medicine. It stinks, absolutely, but it's also a key part of dinner. You find yourself chuckling. Not all smells were sacred. After all, some were just stubborn. There's another saying scratched into a piece of pottery found near Persepolis. A clean house needs no guests, but a scented one brings laughter. It's not famous, but it feels true. You glance around at the simple homes, the dogs dozing in the street, the laundry flapping in the wind with a faint smell of lavender water, and you realize something important. The Persian perfume story isn't just about kings, temples, or trade caravans. It's about people, real people, who lived, worked, laughed, and sighed, scented not for status, but for the soft joys of living. A warm breeze rises. Somewhere, a pot clinks on a stove. Someone laughs, and you breathe in deeply once more. The village quiets as night deepens, the lamps flickering low, the fires dying down. You follow the main road out of town, past fields dotted with fig trees and tamarisk, toward the foothills where wind moves like water and the stars press closer. Now it's time to meet the makers, because behind every vial, every droplet, every whisper scent you've encountered on this journey, there was a person, a craftsperson, an alchemist, an artist of air. And tonight, you're stepping into their world. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. Ancient Persia had a long and well-documented tradition of apothecaries and perfumers, many of whom worked in urban centers like Susa, Ecbatana, and Persepolis. These weren't hobbyists. They were trained artisans, often working from closely guarded family recipes passed down through generations. You approach a modest building near a hillside town, a combination workshop, home, and storefront. It's windowless to protect the temperature-sensitive oils inside. The wooden door creaks, and you step into a room thick with scent. Not one scent, dozens. Your nose twitches, trying to separate them. Cinnamon, rose, something sharp and green, maybe mint, maybe myrtle. It's like walking into an invisible tapestry. A woman in her late 40s stands behind a low counter. Her sleeves are rolled, her hands stained with something golden. She doesn't look up. She's focused on measuring out a syrupy oil, drop by drop, into a small ceramic bottle. She's a master perfumer, and you're just in time to watch her work. One corner of the room holds her tools, Bronze bowls, mortars and pestles, reed sieves, bits of leather used for straining infusions. Dried herbs hang from the ceiling like sleepy chandeliers. In the back, small clay ovens keep mixtures warm, but not hot. Heat too high and the scent breaks. She knows the exact moment to remove a pot. You watch her do it now. No timer, just instinct. Historians still argue how perfumers trained. Some believe they apprenticed under herbalists. Others say it was passed down within families. There's no single answer, but clearly it required more than just recipes. It demanded intuition. You couldn't just follow a scroll. You had to listen to the oil, the way it moved, how it clung to stone or skin. Here's a fringe tidbit. One old manual suggests testing a scent by letting it sit on goat parchment for 7 days. If the parchment still smelled sweet on the 8th, the blend was considered noble. If it turned sour, back to the mortar. The perfumer moves silently, occasionally nodding or whispering to herself. She grinds dried violet petals, stirs a pot of musk oil, then sniffs her wrist, not for vanity but to check balance. Her wrist is a canvas, her nose the brush. On a nearby shelf are her failed experiments, small quart bottles labeled with poetic frustration. Too bitter, fades too fast. Beautiful but stupid. You can't help but laugh softly at that last one. There's a scroll pinned to the wall with notes scribbled in the margins, some of them not even in Persian, but Greek and Aramaic. Recipes didn't follow borders. They wandered, adapted, evolved. A Syrian blend might gain a Persian twist. An Egyptian-based oil might be infused with spices from India. Perfume, like stories, travel best when shared. You ask no questions. There's no need. She offers you a small ceramic dish filled with a deep golden paste. You dip your finger, touch it to your neck. The scent blooms slowly, warm, rich, spiced with cardamom and dried figure. You close your eyes. In that single drop, there's a day in a sun-drenched orchard, a memory of someone laughing, a promise whispered in a language you don't quite understand. It's not just perfume, it's time travel. Here's a quirky detail. Many ancient perfumers named their blends after moods, not ingredients. You buy the Red Noon, or Whisper on the Roof, or Last Day of Spring. The labels told you nothing, but your nose told you everything. She returns to work now, and you wander deeper into the workshop. There's a stone slab covered in resin samples. Frankincense, myrrh, storax, opopanax. Some are powdered, some still sticky. You touch one, and your fingers come away tacky. The smell is sharp, citrusy, medicinal. She sees your face and smiles without looking up. Good for grief, she might say, or maybe that's just what the smell tells you. Historians still debate whether these perfumers saw themselves as healers, artists, or merchants. Probably all three. But in this room, surrounded by jars and steam and silence, you know exactly what she is. She's a translator of the invisible. Because perfume isn't just about what it is. It's about what it becomes on your skin, in your memory, in the air between two people who will never meet again. You thank her with a nod, and she returns it. As you leave, the door swings closed, and you feel the night air hit your face. But even outside, in the wind and dust and quiet, you still smell like something else, like a story you weren't supposed to know. You walk now beneath a moon that feels unusually close, round and soft and the color of polished sandalwood. The road curves along a low ridge. The night brushing your arms like cool linen. You're not headed to a place this time. You're headed to a moment, one last lingering scent before the journey fades. Because for all the royal rituals, desert trades, and poetic metaphors, there's one more chapter in the Persian perfume story. Legacy. What lasted, what survived, what clung to fabric in time long after the jars dried and the scrolls curled in silence. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. The ancient Persian approach to scent profoundly shaped Islamic-era perfumery, then flowed into Byzantine, Indian, and even European traditions. They didn't just preserve perfume culture. They elevated it into an art, a science, a form of worship. You pause now beside a stone outcrop, watching a caravan far below, their torches glowing like scattered stars. You think back to everything you've seen. Gardens of roses harvested at dawn, courts where fragrance choreographed power, temples lit by scented flames, and the simple wax cones in a villager's kitchen. And you realize all that echoed forward. You sit and think about how, centuries after Darius and Xerxes were dust, Persian methods and philosophies shaped the very foundation of modern perfumery. From the copper alembic stills used to distill oils, to the practice of aging infusions in clay, the fingerprints are everywhere. Historians still argue whether the Romans learned these tricks directly from Persian traders or secondhand through Greek scholars. But what's clear is that Persian scent craft didn't vanish. It merely slipped into new bottles, new tongues, new temples. Here's a quirky little survival. A 10th century Arabic text includes a Persian origin recipe for the oil of forgetting, said to help with heartache and memory. It involved sandalwood, crushed lily, and wine left in moonlight. Sound medical? Not exactly. Sound poetic? Absolutely. Even modern Iranian homes keep traces of this past. Ask any grandmother, and she'll tell you, rose water isn't just for desserts. It's for blessings, for grief, for weddings, for a bowl left by the door when guests arrive. The perfume is the gesture, and maybe that's the heart of it. In Persian tradition, scent wasn't just about how something smelled. It was about what it meant. To perfume a body was to prepare for honor. To perfume a letter was to give it weight. To perfume a space was to say, someone here cared enough to make it beautiful. You glance down the hillside, where an old shrine flickers with the last flame of the night. Someone has left a trail of rose petals at the threshold, not for a festival, not for a visitor, just because. A donkey brays in the distance. Somewhere, an oil lamp goes out with a tiny puff of jasmine smoke. You lie back on the ground, arms behind your head, looking up at the stars. The scents from your journey still cling faintly to your imagination, like dust on sandals, like echoes in stone. You remember the prince who lost his nose, the garden perfumers who wrote poetry with petals, the traders who bribed customs officers with cinnamon, the lovers who scented their sleeves with violet oil, the court eunuchs who knew the value of a perfectly timed whiff of clove, and the woman who named her failed blend beautiful but stupid. These aren't just facts in a scroll. They're souls in vapor, people who believe deeply that something invisible could still shape the world. You take one last breath. It smells like cardamom and ash and laughter in the rain. Then, slowly you exhale. The night grows still now. The air is heavy with warmth, like a blanket fresh from the sun. Even the scents around you begin to blur, not fade exactly, but soften. What was once jasmine is now just sweetness. What was once myrrh is now just memory. You don't need names anymore, just sensations. The road behind you is long, but you've walked it gently. Step by step, you follow trails of invisible footprints, left by gardeners and priests, by travelers and queens, by 100 unnamed hands mixing oils in silence. And now, you rest in their company. The stars above are quiet. Even they seem scented tonight. Maybe sandalwood, maybe starlight. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. You shift slightly, sinking deeper into the fabric of sleep. Letting the last traces of story cling to you like mist. The rose gardens fade. The trade roads vanish. The court halls dissolve into shadow. But their fragrance lingers. Still here. Still safe. Still yours. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts unspool like a ribbon in warm wind. You've traveled far tonight. Not through battlefields or tragedies, but through beauty, through the forgotten magic of ordinary people, making something exquisite out of dust and time. And now, you don't need to do anything else. Just rest. Breathe in. Breathe out. Let the perfume of history carry you gently into sleep.